My name is Dr. Sam Turner, and I'm the Director of Archaeology here at the St. Augustine Lighthouse Museum with the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, or LAMP. And one of my fields of expertise is the contact period when the Spaniards first came to the New World. And one of those Spaniards was this fellow, Juan Ponce de León, who has something to do with our state's history. So that's what we're talking about today. So many of you who have been here in town or who have been visiting have noticed this beautiful bronze that we have out in front of the parque of Ponce de León. The identical statue and the identical stand, as you can see here from the top, stands in San Juan, Puerto Rico, outside the cathedral, which you can see here in the background. A lot of people know about Ponce's discovery of Florida, but they don't know much about Ponce before the discovery of Florida, or his involvement with the island of Puerto Rico, or Hispaniola for that matter. Well, with a name like Juan Ponce de León, you know he's a Spaniard. He was born in the province of Valladolid, which is in northern Spain, in this region, south of Asturias. And he was born in the town of San Tervas de Campos. This is a recent Google Earth image of San Tervas de Campos. The most recent population census has 144 people living in town. Now, I'm sure in the 16th century, it was not quite as densely populated. As you can see, this is agricultural land, and so this town made its subsisted on agriculture and livestock. And that is what Ponce's young childhood was all about. This is the church where he was almost certainly baptized in San Tervas. They began building this church in the 12th century AD and finished in the 17th century. So exactly which part of the church was there when Ponce was baptized is anyone in this room's guess, but if you went there and you talked to the priest who ran the place, he could probably tell you most likely where that was. So, Ponce was born in 1474, and he was the illegitimate son of a Spanish nobleman. The Ponce de León family was a very important family in the Reconquest. In particular, they were instrumental in taking Cádiz, which is a major seaport in Spain. And so he's the son of one of those Ponce de Leóns. He, at the age of 10, possibly with the assistance of his father, was placed in an apprenticeship role. He was made the page of Pedro Núñez de Guzmán, who was a knight of the military order of Calatrava. And that was a military, an independent military organization like the Knights Templar or St. John the Hospitallers. But in the 1480s, when that Grand Master of that order died, he was replaced by another person, and when that transition occurred, King Ferdinand took the order under his control. So they went from being an independent military order to a royal military order, loyal to the king. And that was always one of Juan Ponce's hallmarks. He was always loyal to the king, and in all the political fighting that occurred in the New World, he always stayed loyal to the king. So as he grew up under this knight, learning the trade of war and fighting, the final conquest of Spain was underway. And so when he was 13, that's another thing. I have numbers in brackets next to dates. And that's Juan Ponce's age in that particular year. And I think it's when you're thinking about a historical character, it's worth thinking about how old that person was when certain things happened in their life, because depending on where you are in your life's story, you're impacted by certain events in a particular way. So in 1489, at the age of 15, a number of other cities fell. And at this age, at 15, he's probably involved in fighting at this stage. Not so much hanging back in camp, making sure that his knights spurs are polished and all that, but he's actually in combat. And by 1492, when he's 18, he definitely would have participated in the final conquest of Granada, the capital of the last kingdom, the last Moorish kingdom in Spain, Al-Andalus. So Granada and the kingdom of Granada was in this region here in southern Spain. And so the fall of Granada in 1492 represented the end of 800 years of Arabic culture in the Iberian Peninsula. A culture that was renowned for its learning, its appreciation of art, its bloody infighting, lots of things, but it was the end of that world in 1492. This is an illustration of some of the Moorish soldiers in their gear that Ponce would have been confronting in that final battle. And this is the Alhambra, the palace there in that hilltop fortress, and one of the greatest architectural monuments in Spain to this day. So when this world was coming to an end in 1492, another very important event occurred, which was Columbus's voyage to the New World, which began the end of another world, that world being the world of the various Native American peoples over here, because their cultures were about to be impacted by disease and steel. So Columbus came back from his first voyage, and the situation in Spain at the time was you had these military orders, you had all these soldiers, and the war was essentially over. And for 800 years, there had been this culture. It was a martial culture, pretty much geared to war. So there were all these guys hanging around with nothing left to do. Now, Juan Ponce was very well connected because his knight was a very high-status knight. He would eventually become the head of that order. So he got a berth on one of the 17 ships that composed Columbus's second fleet that went to the New World in 1493. And that is when he arrived. On the first voyage, the Santa Maria had been wrecked, and the crew left there in a fort called La Navidad and found that the Spaniards had all been recently killed. The bodies were, well, they weren't quite warm, but I mean, the event had just happened. They found some floating in the creek and all. And it appears that relations had gone bad. So he decided that he wasn't going to settle right there. He'd head down the coast to the east, which would also put him closer to the gold-bearing interior of the island, which was what he was there to do. He was there to trade for gold. So Juan Ponce de León went ashore with the 1,200 other colonists in 1493. And this marked the very beginning of Spanish presence in the New World. And it was to be a permanent presence. So the climate was not what the Spaniards were used to. Their supplies started to go bad. They traded initially with the local Taino Indians for food, but that trade tapered off. The Spaniards ate a lot. Dietarily speaking, they ate 3 or 4 times as much as the locals did. So they quickly ate everybody out of house and home. And that, of course, led to conflicts, as you can imagine. So Columbus decided that what he needed to do is he needed to reduce the Spanish population in Isabela, and at the same time establish control over the gold-bearing interior of the island. So he sent about 500 men. They all marched inland. Columbus went with them, blaring trumpets, shooting cannons and guns to make a very big show. And they got inland, they set up a fort, and then Columbus went back to Isabela and left 500 men there under the command of a man named Pedro Margarit. And Pedro Margarit was himself a knight of a military order of Alcántara. And so it's my belief that because Ponce de León was formally attached to a military order, he probably appealed to this man as somebody he could trust to follow orders and do as he was told. And so I believe that Ponce had left Isabela and went into the interior at this time. One of the most important things about Ponce de León is that he actually survived this whole beginning, because a lot of Spaniards didn't. Hundreds and hundreds died of disease and starvation, and he did not. So they were in the interior, and the discipline in the fort sort of went away. They were just out in the woods. The barter for gold went away because the Indians quickly bartered all the gold they had, and then they didn't have any more. And there was still the food problem. So the Spaniards just started disappearing into the forest, and Pedro Margarit didn't like the situation at all, went back to Isabella, took a ship for Spain, and never came back. So I have from 1498 to, 94 to 98, gone native. He basically mixed in with the Taino population. He learned their language, he learned their food ways, he learned how they fought. And of course, you have hundreds of Spaniards now in the interior, and in some cases, they're living with the Tainos and getting along well, and in other cases, they're not. So in the cases that was not happening, eventually became violent, and so war broke out. And so in 1495, there's something called the Battle of the Vega, and it was a huge Indian army was raised, and essentially the Spaniards mustered everybody that they could to fight in that battle. And so it's probable that Ponce de León fought in the Battle of the Vega in 1495 at the age of 21. So then gold was found on the south coast, which was a really good thing because all the barter gold was gone and the enterprise was looking financially bankrupt. And the king and the queen were like, I don't know, this deal's not really working out for anybody. But then they found all these gold nuggets in the river. And Columbus went back with a sample. The king was very happy. And so the Spanish venture continued. In 1497, there's a rebellion against Columbus' authority. And Ponce was almost certainly not involved in that rebellion. First of all, that rebellion occurred in Isabella, because when the gold find happened on the south coast, Bartholomew Columbus, who'd been left in charge, took all his buddies and his retainers and his confidants down to the south coast to begin mining gold, and everybody else was left in Isabella with not much food and no career prospects, shall we say. So it's no surprise that they rebelled. One of the men who rebelled played a prominent role in a military campaign that Ponce de León also played a role in. And Las Casas, who is a chronicler, describes this one gentleman as having been one of the rebels who had fought with Francisco Roldan against the Columbuses. And Ponce is never mentioned as being involved in that. And so I think, A, he wasn't in Isabella, and B, he was a king's man. He would not have engaged in that sort of activity. But there was a 7-month standoff as these guys stood out a fort in the middle of the island where Bartholomew Columbus was holed up. And then a ship came bearing the news that actually the Columbuses are still in power, and Bartholomew's been given a big fat promotion. So all those rebels went to the western part of the island, and they set up their own little kingdom, essentially. And that proved problematic later. So the Columbuses were eventually fired by this guy, Francisco de Bobadilla, who was sent to investigate what was going on. And the economic situation on the island was dire. Ponce was probably involved in gold mining at this time because he was involved in gold mining later. And so what Bobadilla did to alleviate the economic situation and to make everybody like him was he lifted the king's gold tax. He said, no more taxes on gold. He overreached his authority a bit on that. So the king was not pleased, and he sent this fellow, Nicolas de Ovando. Nicolas de Ovando was also of a military order, and the king said to him, you know, there's a lot going wrong with that island. I need you to go there, and I need you to take care of it and do what you have to get that island under complete Spanish royal control. I don't want problems with the Indians. I want everybody to obey the law under the king's command. And so he did that. He arrived, and he brutally suppressed the Indians on the western and central part of the island. And then there were a couple of military campaigns on the eastern end of the island in Higüey. Higüey was not gold-bearing. It was agricultural, and it produced a lot of the bread, it was called cassava bread, that went to support the gold mining operations.